The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the alien message. It wasn't the impossible language, or the way it appeared simultaneously on every screen across Earth. It wasn't even the ultimatum, surrender or be erased, that followed seconds later with chilling clarity. It was what happened after, because humanity didn't panic. No riots, no emergency broadcasts filled with fear, no desperate negotiations. For 12 long minutes, the entire planet went quiet. Satellites recorded cities frozen mid-motion, highways stalled, conversations cut short like someone had pressed pause on civilization itself. And then, all at once, Earth responded. Not with words, not with weapons, with a single global transmission. We are removing the limits. The alien coalition monitoring Earth, an alliance that had conquered hundreds of worlds, initially misinterpreted it as a translation error. Their linguistic systems reprocessed it. Their predictive models recalculated human behavioral patterns. Their war simulations updated. Every outcome returned the same conclusion. The message made no sense. So they watched. Orbital surveillance intensified as they prepared for the expected military mobilization, defensive formations, energy spikes from primitive weapon systems. Instead, what they saw triggered something far more unsettling, something that models had no framework to understand. Across Earth, facilities that didn't officially exist began to open. Deep underground vaults, isolated research complexes, black sites buried beneath oceans, deserts, and ice. Places not listed in any global registry suddenly came online, their security protocols dissolving as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. Doors opened, not outward, inward. From those places, people began to emerge. At first, they didn't look like soldiers. No uniforms, no formations, no signs of coordination. Just individuals, walking, limping, sometimes laughing, stepping out into a world that seemed to have been holding its breath for them. Alien observers flagged anomalies immediately. These humans did not behave like the rest. Their movements were erratic, their biometrics unstable, heart rate spiking and dropping without pattern, neural activity irregular. In some cases, dangerously so. In others, disturbingly calm. Even more concerning, there was no visible chain of command. No one was directing them. No one was controlling them. And yet, across the planet, the same process was unfolding with terrifying precision. Facilities opening, individuals released, systems disabling themselves one by one, as if something had overridden humanity's own safeguards. The Coalition's strategic AI attempted to categorize the event. It failed, because what it was seeing wasn't chaos. It was something worse. It was deliberate. Then came the second anomaly. Global psychological suppression networks, systems the aliens hadn't even known existed, began shutting down. Subtle infrastructures woven into human society, regulating behavior, stabilizing populations, suppressing extreme neurological responses. All of it went offline in under 3 minutes. For the first time since they had begun observing Earth, the Coalition detected a shift, not in technology, not in military capability, but in humanity itself. Something fundamental had changed. And then, buried deep within intercepted human communications, a single phrase surfaced. It wasn't broadcast. It wasn't announced. It was whispered between systems, repeated like a confirmation code. Containment protocols lifted. That was the moment the alien coalition realized their mistake. Earth wasn't preparing to defend itself. It was undoing something it had spent centuries building. And whatever it had just unleashed was something even humans had once been afraid of. The coalition did what it had always done when faced with uncertainty. It observed, analyzed, and prepared to dominate. Their fleets held position beyond the outer orbit, silent and patient, waiting for the moment humanity revealed its strategy. In every prior conquest, that moment had come quickly. Fear led to desperation. Desperation led to mistakes. And mistakes led to surrender. But Earth was not behaving according to any known pattern. The individuals released from those hidden facilities did not report to military bases. They did not assemble into units. They did not even acknowledge each other in any structured way. Instead, they dispersed into cities, into abandoned zones, into places with no apparent strategic value. Some vanished into dense population centers. Others moved toward areas already deemed tactically irrelevant. It looked like disorder. It looked like failure. But the coalition's predictive systems began to falter, because wherever these individuals went, something changed. At first, the shifts were subtle. A communication relay malfunctioned without cause. A surveillance drone lost signal for exactly 7 seconds before returning online, its internal logs corrupted beyond recovery. A small orbital probe, positioned to monitor atmospheric fluctuations, began transmitting contradictory data, impossible readings that defied physical laws. Then the incidents escalated. A coalition reconnaissance vessel stationed in high orbit reported a temporary systems blackout. Not an attack, not damage, just absence. For 2.3 seconds, every system aboard the ship ceased functioning. Lights, navigation, internal sensors, everything went dark. When systems rebooted, there was no trace of intrusion, no foreign code, no breach. Only one anomaly remained. A single line of text embedded deep within the ship's diagnostic logs. Still watching. The message was written in perfect coalition syntax. That was not possible. Earth did not possess that level of linguistic precision. Not without years of direct exposure. Not without access. The coalition flagged it as a potential psychological tactic. But that explanation did not hold, because the message wasn't transmitted. It was placed. Meanwhile, on Earth, the released individuals continued to behave in ways that defied classification. Some integrated seamlessly into society, blending into crowd with unsettling ease. Others did the opposite, drawing attention, provoking reactions, creating disturbances that spread far beyond their immediate presence. One man walked into a financial district and began speaking loudly to no one in particular. Within minutes, arguments broke out around him. Within an hour, the entire block was in chaos. Fights, panic, systems failing in a cascading chain reaction that no one could trace back to a single cause. Another individual entered a secure data facility without force, without resistance, and without leaving any record of entry. By the time the breach was discovered, nothing had been stolen, nothing had been altered, except for one thing. Every predictive algorithm in the building had been subtly adjusted, not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to be wrong. The coalition began to understand that these were not isolated incidents. This was a pattern, but it was a pattern designed to look like randomness. And that made it far more dangerous. Their war doctrine relied on prediction. Every battle, every engagement, every decision was calculated through layers of probability. They did not need to understand their enemies completely. They only needed to anticipate them. But humanity was removing that advantage. Piece by piece, across multiple systems, coalition forces began reporting inconsistencies. Minor at first, then increasingly severe. Navigation routes that should have been optimal led to delays. Tactical formations that had worked for centuries produced unexpected vulnerabilities. Communication chains developed micro-delays that compounded over time, disrupting synchronization. It was as if the entire framework of order was being quietly destabilized, not attacked, undermined. The coalition's central intelligence initiated a deeper analysis of human behavior. It searched for command structures, leadership nodes, any sign of centralized control. It found none. Instead, it found something far more unsettling. Outcome-based behavior. These humans were not following orders. They were moving toward results. And they were doing so without coordination, without communication, and without regard for conventional logic. That should not have been possible. And yet, the results were undeniable. Then came the first direct encounter. A small coalition strike team was deployed to intercept one of the identified individuals moving through an abandoned urban zone. The objective was simple: capture, analyze, understand. The team approached with standard formation, precise and controlled. What they encountered was neither. The human did not run, did not hide, did not resist in any recognizable way. Instead, he moved, not toward them, not away from them, but through them. What followed lasted less than 30 seconds. When it ended, the strike team was incapacitated, not by superior force, not by advanced weaponry, but by something far more disorienting. They could not explain what had happened. Their reports were fragmented, inconsistent. One claimed the human had been in multiple places at once. Another insisted there had been more than one target. A third reported that the human had anticipated every move before it happened. All three were certain of one thing. They had not been fighting a soldier. They had been reacting to something they could not predict. The coalition reviewed the footage. It showed nothing unusual. And that was the problem. Because something had clearly happened. Something their systems could not see. Something their models could not process. For the first time in recorded history, the coalition faced an enemy it could not define. And somewhere on Earth, in a facility that had not yet opened, a system remained locked, waiting for a signal that had not yet been given. The coalition escalated. They had no choice. For the first time in centuries, their model stopped offering solutions and started offering warnings. Not probabilities of victory, warnings of instability. Entire predictive frameworks collapsed into error loops whenever human variables were introduced. The more data they gathered, the less accurate their systems became. So they did what superior civilizations always do when understanding fails. They moved to force clarity. A full reconnaissance wing was deployed, fast, precise, overwhelming. Not to conquer, not yet, but to engage directly, to provoke a measurable response. If humanity would not reveal its strategy, the coalition would drag it into the open. Their ships entered low orbit in coordinated formation, a display of control so perfect it had broken countless species before a single shot was fired. Earth did not respond. No defensive fleets rose to meet them. No missile systems activated. No attempt was made to challenge orbital superiority. Instead, the silence continued. And then the humans moved. Not all at once. Not in formation. Individually. Across continents. Across cities. Across places a coalition had already categorized as irrelevant. Human activity began to spike. But not in ways that resembled mobilization. Small groups formed and dissolved without pattern. Individuals changed direction mid-action for no visible reason. Movements overlapped, intersected, and diverged like threads in design that could only be seen from a perspective the coalition did not possess. Then the first orbital strike was authorized, a controlled demonstration. A single precision beam targeted an uninhabited desert zone where multiple anomalous human signals had converged. The intent was clear: eliminate variables, observe reaction. The beam fired. The ground was erased in a flash of white heat. And for a fraction of a second, everything aligned. Every coalition sensor, every tracking system, every observational feed locked onto the impact point with perfect clarity. And then, the data fractured, not corrupted, not lost, fractured. Multiple conflicting outcomes appeared simultaneously in the system logs. In one version, the strike had succeeded, no survivors, no movement. In another, heat signatures remained active within the blast radius. In a third, the strike had never occurred at all. The system could not reconcile the contradiction. They began rejecting their own inputs. For the first time, coalition operators were forced to rely on direct visual confirmation, and what they saw made even them hesitate. The desert was still there, not untouched, but not destroyed. Fragments of glass sand shimmered across a landscape that should have been obliterated. And within that impossible terrain, figures were moving, slowly, casually, as if the strike had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. That was when the coalition realized the nature of the battlefield had changed. This was no longer a physical conflict. It was perceptual. Their senses were no longer reliable. Their data was no longer truth. And the humans were exploiting that. Engagement protocols shifted immediately. Direct confrontations were initiated across multiple zones, each designed to isolate and study human combat behavior. The results were consistent and deeply disturbing. Humans did not fight to control territory. They fought to disrupt function. Strike teams reported engagements where objectives dissolved mid-operation. Orders lost relevance as situations changed faster than they could be processed. Enemies appeared where none had been detected. Threats emerged from directions that had already been cleared. In one encounter, a coalition unit secured a structure, confirmed it empty, and established a perimeter. 7 minutes later, they were under attack from inside the same structure. There had been no entry, no breach, no indication of infiltration, and yet the humans were already there. In another case, a squad pursued a single target through a narrow corridor system. The target remained visible at all times. Distance closed steadily. Capture was imminent. Until the corridor ended. The human was gone. No exits. No hidden paths. No explanation. Only a single marking left behind on the wall, scratched into the surface with something crude, almost careless. "You're thinking too straight." That phrase began appearing in multiple locations. Different handwriting. Same message. It spread through coalition channels, flagged as psychological interference. But the effect was undeniable, because it was true. Their entire system, every tactic, every formation, every decision, relied on linear progression, cause and effect, action and reaction, order, and humans were breaking that, not by overpowering it, but by stepping outside it. Then came the next layer. Interception logs began capturing human communications that didn't match any known structure. Not language, not code, something else. Patterns within patterns. Signals that shifted meaning depending on context, timing, even observer interpretation. Coalition AI attempted to decode them. It failed because the messages were not fixed. They adapted, which meant only one thing. The humans weren't just unpredictable. They were making unpredictability systematic. And then, buried within one intercepted transmission, something new appeared. Not a message, a designation. Phase 1 stabilization complete. Stabilization. The word sent a ripple through Coalition Command, because nothing about what they were witnessing felt stable. If this was controlled, then what came next? The Coalition had fought species that relied on instinct, species that relied on numbers, and species that relied on machines. It had broken hive minds, dismantled collective intelligences, and crushed civilizations that believed chaos itself could be a weapon. But this was different, because the chaos was not spreading randomly. It was targeting structure, and structure was everything the Coalition depended on. At first, the disruptions were dismissed as localized interference, a command relay delayed by milliseconds, a targeting system recalibrating twice instead of once. Minor inefficiencies, annoying, but insignificant in the scale of a galactic war machine. Then those inefficiencies began to align. A fleet maneuver, executed with flawless precision, arrived exactly where it was supposed to, and still failed. Enemy presence appeared where scans had shown nothing. Defensive fire was deployed perfectly and hit nothing at all. Countermeasures activated in response to threats that did not exist, while real attacks slipped through unnoticed. The Coalition's greatest strength, its perfect coordination, was beginning to fracture from within. And the worst part was, nothing was technically wrong. Every system reported full functionality. Every command was executed correctly. Every calculation was accurate. But the outcome was wrong. It was as if reality itself had shifted just enough to make perfection meaningless. The first major collapse came without warning. A mid-tier command fleet, positioned near a contested orbital zone, initiated a standard defensive grid. Formation locked, weapons primed, sensors active across all spectrums. Then, without any external trigger, the fleet opened fire. On itself, the logs later showed no evidence of hacking, no signal intrusion, no override of command authority. Each vessel had independently identified Allied ships as hostile targets and responded accordingly. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. By the time emergency shutdown protocols engaged, half the fleet was gone. The survivors reported the same thing. For a brief moment, everything had made sense. Every target had been correct. Every action justified. Until it wasn't. Coalition analysts reviewed the data repeatedly, searching for a cause. They found a pattern, not in the systems, in the decisions. Micro-adjustments, tiny deviations in threat assessment, slight reinterpretations of sensor input, each change insignificant on its own. But together, they had rewritten the outcome of the entire engagement. The fleet had not been attacked. It had been convinced. That realization spread faster than any signal, because if decisions could be influenced without detection, then control was already compromised. Meanwhile, on Earth, the human activity that had once seemed chaotic began revealing something far more structured beneath the surface. The individuals released from containment were not acting randomly. They were acting contextually. Each movement, each disruption, each seemingly irrational action aligned with a larger effect, one that only became visible after it had already happened. A data hub destabilized here. A communication chain fractured there. A decision delayed just long enough to cascade into failure. No single action was decisive, but together they created something unstoppable. Momentum. The coalition began to understand the battlefield had shifted again. This was no longer about fighting forces. It was about controlling outcomes, and humans were rewriting them in real time. Desperate to regain control, the coalition initiated a full-spectrum countermeasure. Centralized command authority was reinforced. Autonomous decision-making systems were restricted. Every action required verification through multiple layers of confirmation. Order was tightened. Control was reinforced. For a brief moment, stability returned, and then it shattered, because the humans adapted, almost instantly. Where the coalition slowed itself down to ensure accuracy, humans accelerated. Where decisions required confirmation, humans acted without hesitation. Where systems waited for certainty, humans operated in ambiguity. And that gap became a weapon. Engagements that should have been easily contained spiraled out of control before the coalition could respond. By the time authorization was granted, the situation had already changed. By the time orders were issued, they were already obsolete. The coalition had perfected control. Humanity had abandoned it, and in doing so, they had gained something far more dangerous. Speed without hesitation. Action without doubt. Then came the psychological fractures. Not in systems. In minds. Coalition soldiers, trained from birth to operate with precision and discipline, began experiencing anomalies during engagements. Not fear, not panic, uncertainty. They reported moments where the enemy seemed to anticipate actions before they were taken. Situations where no option felt correct. Decisions that should have been simple became impossible to commit to. One soldier described it as standing at the center of too many futures at once. Another refused to engage entirely, claiming that every possible action led to failure. Medical analysis found no neurological damage, no external interference. Only one conclusion remained. Their perception of cause and effect had been destabilized. The humans weren't just attacking systems. They were attacking certainty itself. And without certainty, the coalition's entire doctrine began to unravel. Then, in the middle of a routine intercept, something happened that forced even the highest command to reconsider the nature of the war. A coalition intelligence unit successfully captured a human operative. No resistance, no evasion. The human had simply stopped, allowed capture, and when questioned, the operative did not resist, did not lie, did not remain silent. Instead, he smiled, not with defiance, not with fear, but with something far more unsettling. Recognition. You're starting to see it now, he said calmly, as if speaking to someone who had just solved a puzzle too late. The interrogator demanded answers, explanations, strategy. The human shook his head slightly. You still think this is phase 1, he said. There was a pause, a moment where the words didn't fully register. Then the interrogator asked the only question that mattered. What happens in phase 2? For the first time, the human's smile faded. For several seconds, the human said nothing. The silence stretched longer than any answer could have, pulling tension tight inside the interrogation chamber. Coalition analysts monitored every micro-expression, every neural fluctuation, every subtle change in breathing. They expected deception, resistance, psychological deflection. Instead, they saw hesitation, not fear, something else. The human leaned back slightly, studying the interrogator with an expression that was almost evaluative, as if he were deciding whether the question itself was worth answering. You're asking the wrong thing, he said finally. The interrogator's tone sharpened, then corrected. Another pause. Then the human exhaled slowly, as if settling into a conversation rather than an interrogation. You think phase 2 is escalation, he said. More force, more chaos, something worse than what you've already seen. His eyes shifted, not away, but deeper, as if focusing on something beyond the room. It's not. That answer triggered immediate internal alerts across Coalition Command. If this was an escalation, then what was it? The interrogator pressed harder. Define Phase 2. The human's gaze returned, steady and unflinching. Phase 1 was about removing limits, he said. You figured that out by now. Behavioral constraints, predictive patterns, the things that make us manageable. He gestured faintly, not at himself, but at the concept, everything your systems rely on. The interrogator remained silent, allowing him to continue. Phase 2, the human said, is what happens when those limits don't come back. That was not an answer. That was a problem. Coalition analysts immediately flagged the statement for deeper analysis, but even before the model could process it, the implication began to spread. Phase 1 had been temporary, controlled, contained. Phase 2 was not. The interrogator leaned forward. You're suggesting a loss of control. The human smiled faintly. No, he said. I'm suggesting we stop trying to control it. That statement disrupted every known framework of strategic logic. No species willingly abandoned control. Not in war, not in survival, because control was the only thing that separated order from collapse. The interrogator's voice lowered. That would destroy your own civilization. The human nodded. Yes. No hesitation. No denial. Just acceptance. That's the part you don't understand, he continued. You think we're trying to win this war. A brief pause. We're trying to make sure you lose it. The distinction was subtle, but it changed everything, because winning required preservation. Losing did not. Coalition Command began cross-referencing every engagement, every anomaly, every disruption they had encountered since the beginning of the conflict. A new pattern emerged. Humans were not optimizing for survival. They were optimizing for impact, damage per action, cost per outcome. They were willing to trade anything, resources, territory, even their own stability, as long as the result forced a coalition to pay more. It wasn't strategy. It was asymmetry taken to its absolute extreme. The interrogator felt the shift, even without access to the data. You're saying this is intentional, he said. The human tilted his head slightly. Everything you've seen so far, he replied. That's us holding back. That statement hit harder than any threat, because nothing about what the coalition had experienced felt restrained. The interrogator studied him carefully. Then why haven't you moved to Phase 2? For the first time, something changed in the human's expression. Not fear, but reluctance. A subtle tightening around the eyes. A fractional delay before answering. Because for the first time, the answer mattered. Because once it starts, he said quietly, it doesn't stop. Silence again. He continued, slower now. Phase 1 is reversible. We can shut it down, put the limits back, rebuild what we broke. A pause. Phase 2 rewrites us. The word settled heavily into the room, not as a threat, but as a warning. The interrogator's voice was almost cautious now. Into what? The human didn't answer immediately. When he did, it was softer. Something that doesn't need limits. That was the moment the coalition understood the true scale of what they were facing. Not a species fighting for survival. Not an enemy adapting to war. But a civilization standing at the edge of its own transformation and willing to cross it. The interrogator tried one final angle. You expect us to believe you would destroy yourselves just to stop us. The human shook his head slowly. No, he said, we wouldn't destroy ourselves. A faint smile returned. We'd just become something you can't survive. That distinction was far worse, because destruction was predictable. Transformation was not. At that exact moment, across coalition space, new signals began to appear. Subtle at first, then undeniable. Deep within Earth's networks, systems that had remained dormant since the beginning of the conflict activated. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like something waking up. Coalition analysts scrambled to identify the change. They found a single new designation entering human communication channels. Not broadcast, not announced, but spreading with quiet certainty. Phase 2, pending authorization. And for the first time since the war began, the coalition felt something it had never needed to process before. Not uncertainty, Not confusion, but something far more dangerous. Anticipation of what came next. The coalition did not wait for authorization to become action. They moved first. Across every contested system, fleets were repositioned, supply lines reinforced, command hierarchies tightened to their absolute limit. Redundancies were laid upon redundancies, every possible variable accounted for, every weakness sealed. If Phase 2 meant loss of control, then the only answer was absolute control. They would compress the battlefield until nothing unpredictable could exist within it. For a brief moment, it worked. Engagement stabilized. Movements became trackable again. Human activity, once erratic, appeared to slow, almost as if constrained by the coalition's tightening grip. Decision trees began producing usable outcomes again. Predictions, while still imperfect, regained partial reliability. The coalition interpreted this as progress. As containment, they were wrong, because what they were seeing was not resistance. It was observation. Human forces did not push back. They adjusted. Across multiple fronts, they began withdrawing, not in retreat, but in deliberate repositioning. Units disengaged at the exact moment before encirclement. Operations halted just before interception. Entire engagement dissolved second before coalition forces could act. It was as if the humans were allowing the coalition to believe it had regained control, testing the limits of that belief, and mapping it. Then, the first fracture appeared. A command fleet operating under the new reinforced protocols received a sequence of orders, validated, confirmed, and cross-verified through every layer of authority. The commands were flawless and completely wrong. They redirected the fleet into a sector that had already been cleared. At least, that's what the system showed. When the fleet arrived, it found itself surrounded, not by ships, by absence. Sensors failed to register anything, yet weapon impact began tearing through formation from vectors that did not exist. Defensive systems responded, firing into empty space, while damage reports escalated beyond comprehension. The fleet was being dismantled by something it could not perceive, not invisible, undefined. By the time emergency withdrawal protocols activated, it was too late. The fleet did not retreat. It disintegrated. And in the aftermath, one piece of data remained intact across every surviving system. A timestamp, the exact moment the first incorrect order had been issued. Coalition analysts trace it back. The command had been valid. The authorization real. The decision human. Not through infiltration. Not through control. But through influence. Somewhere in the chain of command, a decision had been nudged just enough to redirect an entire fleet into failure. That was when the coalition understood the next layer of the war. Humans were no longer disrupting outcomes. They were shaping decisions before they happened, and that meant the battlefield extended far beyond physical space. It was now inside the coalition itself. Panic did not spread, but pressure did. Every commander, every strategist, every decision-maker began operating under new condition. Doubt, not of their systems, of themselves. Every choice carried a question. Was this my decision? Or theirs? That hesitation slowed everything, and humans accelerated again. Strikes increased in frequency and unpredictability. Engagement became shorter, sharper, more precise, not in execution, but in effect. Each action created ripple effects that expanded far beyond the immediate target. A supply disruption here triggered resource shortages 3 systems away. A delayed response in one sector caused cascading failures across an entire defense network. The coalition's structure, once its greatest strength, had become a network of vulnerabilities waiting to be triggered, and humans were pressing them all. Then came the escalation, not from the coalition, from Earth. It began with a signal. Short, unremarkable, but unmistakable. Authorization window open. The phrase spread through human networks with a speed that bypassed conventional transmission methods. It didn't propagate through channels. It appeared, simultaneously, everywhere. Coalition intelligence flagged it immediately. Phase 2. The words alone were enough to shift the entire strategic landscape, because now it was no longer a possibility. It was imminent. Coalition leadership convened at the highest level. For the first time in their history, they faced a decision without a clear optimal path. Continue the war and risk triggering something they could not model, or withdraw and concede to a species they had already deemed inferior. Neither option aligned with their doctrine, and yet both were real. Meanwhile, on Earth, something began to change. The individuals who had once moved with chaotic precision started to converge, not physically, behaviorally. Their actions, once unpredictable even to observers, began aligning in subtle ways, not coordinated, not synchronized, but resonant. Patterns began to emerge within the chaos, not reducing it, amplifying it, and within those patterns, coalition analysts detected something new. Consistency, not in movement, in intent. Whatever Phase 2 was, it was not about removing limits. It was about replacing them with something else, something that did not rely on control, or structure, or restraint. And then, buried within intercepted human transmissions, a final phrase surfaced. Not repeated, not broadcast, just present. We won't need to choose anymore. That was when the coalition realized the true danger. Phase 2 was not escalation. It was evolution, and if it completed, there would be nothing left to negotiate with. The coalition had faced extinction before, not as a certainty, but as a possibility. Rogue phenomena, unstable stars, species that consumed everything in their path. Each time, the response had been the same: calculate, adapt, overcome. This was the first time extinction felt internal, not something approaching from the outside, something spreading through the structure of their own decisions. The Emergency Council convened in full, not as a display of power, but as a necessity. Thousands of strategic minds, each trained to think with absolute clarity, now forced to confront a reality where clarity itself had become unreliable. The central question was simple: continue the war, or end it. But the simplicity was deceptive, because continuing meant more than risk. It meant exposure. Every engagement had proven the same truth. The longer the conflict lasted, the deeper the humans reached. Not into territory, not into infrastructure, into behavior, into perception, into the very process by which the coalition understood reality. Reports flooded in from across every front. Commanders hesitating before issuing orders. Units delaying action, not out of fear, but because every option felt equally flawed. Entire fleets requesting reassignment, not due to losses, but due to something far harder to quantify: loss of certainty. One report stood out above the rest. A high-ranking strategist, one of the coalition's most reliable decision-makers, submitted a voluntary removal request. His reasoning was included: I can no longer distinguish between optimal decisions and influence ones. Every outcome appears equally compromised. That statement echoed through the council, because if their best minds could no longer trust themselves, then the war was already lost. And still, pride resisted. Voices rose within the chamber, arguing for escalation, for overwhelming force, for pushing past the disruption and reasserting dominance through sheer scale. But others countered with a more unsettling truth. Scale no longer mattered. The humans were not fighting the coalition's strength. They were turning it. Every additional fleet, every reinforcement, every expansion of the war only created more structure, more connections, more points of influence, more ways to break them. Then the final intelligence briefing arrived, not from external observation, from within human networks. A fragment, incomplete, but enough. It contained a projection, not of strategy, of outcome. If Phase 2 activated, human behavior would shift beyond reversible parameters. Decision-making would no longer be influenced by survival, stability, or long-term consequence. It would be driven by something else, something the coalition could not model, because it had no equivalent. The projection did not show victory or defeat. It showed collapse, not of one side, of the system itself. War, as the coalition understood it, would cease to function. There would be no patterns to exploit, no outcomes to predict, no logic to counter, only continuous, unbounded disruption. And once that state was reached, it would not be limited to the battlefield. It would spread, because humans did not isolate chaos. They carried it. That was when the realization finally settled across the council. This was not a war they could win, not because they were weaker, but because winning required rules. and humans were preparing to remove them permanently. Silence fell over the chamber. Not forced, not commanded, just inevitable. The Emperor, silent until now, finally spoke. Not with authority, with clarity. "We are not facing an enemy that seeks victory," he said. "We are facing one that seeks consequence." The distinction ended the debate, because consequence could not be defeated, only avoided, and avoidance required something the coalition had not exercised in 4,000 years. Restraint. The decision was made, not unanimously, but decisively. The war would end, not because the coalition had been defeated in battle, but because continuing it would lead to something far worse than defeat. Across all systems, orders were transmitted simultaneously. Cease engagement. Withdraw to defensive positions. Initiate diplomatic channels. The commands were clear, immediate, irreversible, and for the first time since the war began, human forces did not interfere. They did not accelerate. They did not escalate. They paused, as if waiting, watching, evaluating. On Earth, the convergence deepened. The patterns within human behavior tightened, not into order, but into alignment. The chaotic resonance that had begun forming now approached something dangerously close to coherence. Whatever Phase 2 was, it was ready. All it required was a decision to begin, and somewhere, deep within the systems that govern what remained of human restraint, a final prompt activated, awaiting input. Proceed? The prompt did not belong to a machine. That was the first truth humanity would never fully admit. There was no central system, no single authority waiting to press a button and begin Phase 2. No command structure that could be targeted, negotiated with, or destroyed. The prompt existed everywhere, in every release mind, in every fractured pattern, in every human who had stepped beyond the limits they had once lived within. Proceed was not a question asked by a system. It was a question asked by humanity to itself, and for a moment that stretched across an entire planet, the answer did not come. Coalition fleets, already in the early stages of withdrawal, held position just long enough to observe, not out of strategy, not out of defiance, but out of something dangerously close to hope. Because for the first time since the war began, the outcome was not being forced. It was being chosen. On Earth, the convergence reached its peak. Cities that had once been filled with erratic movement now pulsed with something quieter. Not calm, not stability, control, but not the kind the coalition understood. This was not imposed order. It was restraint, chosen in the presence of absolute freedom. The individuals who had moved without pattern now slowed, not because they were directed to, not because they were contained, but because they could. That distinction changed everything, because it proved something the coalition had not considered possible. Humans had not removed their limits because they lacked control. They had removed them because they were capable of choosing when to have them. The prompt remained. Proceed. And then, across human networks, a response appeared. Not loud, not unified, but consistent. No, the effect was immediate, not explosive, not dramatic, but undeniable. The resonance began to fade, not vanish, not disappear, but settle, like a storm that had reached its peak and chosen not to break. Phase 2 did not begin, but it did not need to, because the message had already been delivered. The coalition understood it with absolute clarity. Humanity had stood at the edge of something irreversible, and stepped back, not because it couldn't go forward, but because it decided not to. That was the moment the war truly ended. Not with a ceasefire, not with a withdrawal, but with that choice, because it revealed the one thing the coalition had feared more than chaos. Control over chaos. Diplomatic channels opened without resistance. Negotiations began without hostility. Terms were agreed upon with a speed that bypassed tradition, protocol, even pride. The coalition withdrew completely, not as a tactical repositioning, not as a temporary concession, but as a final decision. They would not fight a species that could become something worse than war itself, and choose not to. Peace was established, not built on trust, not built on respect, but built on understanding, a shared recognition of a line that should never be crossed, and of the species that had proven it could cross it and return. In the years that followed, humanity restored its systems. The containment protocols were rebuilt, the safeguards re-established, society resumed. On the surface, everything appeared unchanged, but beneath it, something remained. Not active, not visible, but present. The memory of what had been released, and the knowledge that it could be released again. The coalition never forgot that. Neither did humanity, because the war had not been won through strength, or technology, or strategy. It had been won through something far more dangerous. The willingness to become something unstoppable, and the strength to stop anyway. And somewhere, deep within systems that no longer officially existed, the prompt remained, silent, waiting, just in case the answer ever changed.